This is going to be a follow-up of my previous video where I made some molds for a rather simple sculpt. This time I'm going to go over how I make molds for minis that are a little less straightforward, a little more complicated in shape. So these are the two minis I'm going to be using for this. As you can see, a bit more complex with limbs spread out and really not following an easy flat plane. I'm making homemade molding putty for this. The first ingredient is cornstarch. I just make sure to cover my mixing dish with plenty of cornstarch. It's okay to have plenty left over. The second ingredient is 100% silicone caulking. Once I get some of that onto the dish, I just knead the cornstarch into the caulking until I get a ball of putty that isn't too sticky anymore. Some people prefer to mix this putty up with a putty knife, but I feel it goes more quickly with your hands. Wear gloves or coat your hands in cornstarch. There are two reasons I'm not using the store-bought silicone putty I used in my last video. First, this homemade stuff is a little bit cheaper, but also, and more importantly, it takes much longer to set. The store-bought Easy Mold gets noticeably harder after only 10-15 minutes and is already hard to work with, so you gotta be quick. Whereas this homemade stuff will still be very workable after even an hour or two. You have plenty of working time with this kind of putty, and if you start working with it and it's still too sticky, you can either add more cornstarch or just wait an hour for it to cure just a little bit. Once I've got a batch of my putty mixed up, I pinch some off for the first mini, and with the base flat on the table, put some putty down behind it and just slowly push the mini into the putty. Just like with the simpler molds I did in my last video, I'm aiming to get a plane that follows the sides of the figure, only because the figure's pose is more dynamic, leaning forward a bit with arms slightly forward. The plane needs to follow that so it's not a complete straight line up and down. So what I mean is that I want this first half of the mold to engulf a lot of the figure, but not so much that it's going right around a limb. I don't want to bend the mold too much to get the figure out. I want it to come straight out easily. So I check to make sure the figure is deep enough, but that the putty isn't going too far around any part. And lastly, just double check the edges and bring the putty in tight. If the putty is too soft for this, you can wait a while for it to cure a little and try again. Unlike the Easy Mold, which cures much more quickly, this stuff will take most of the day. Longer wait time, but also longer work time to get everything just right. It's the next day now, and I'm mixing up the second half for both minis. You can wear gloves or use a putty knife to mix this, but it's not a big deal. After I'm done mixing this up, I use a sculpting tool to scrape my fingers clean, and then just rinse the cornstarch off in the sink. I put the second half on in layers, starting with a really thin layer, then pressing the rest on over the thin layer. I do this just to make sure I really get the putty in every little crack and wrinkle, and get it really tight up against the first layer of the mold all around the edges of the figure. This putty ended up being still a little sticky, and I should have just dealt with that. But I made a little mistake here. I applied cooking spray to my fingers to make them not stick to the putty. It worked great, but since I applied the putty in layers, I got oil on the back of the lowest layer, and so the rest of the putty did not stick so great to the thin layer. You'll see the results when I open the molds to take the original figures out. Here they are again quite a while later. As I feared, not everything in the second half stuck together. Be very careful using oil on your fingers, or don't use oil at all. It's still usable like this, but I ended up gluing these parts back together, and if I really want to use this mold a lot, it might be better off redoing the second halves of the mold. Anyways, just like I did with the simple molds from my last video, I'm going to work clay into the first halves. I'm using a different clay though. Polymer clay worked well enough for the simpler molds because all the limbs were together against the body and the geometric plane was simpler. But I'm going to go with more durable clay for this project. This is epoxy sculpt. It mixes in two parts like green stuff or milliput and takes quite a bit longer to harden than polymer clay in an oven. It doesn't need to be baked like polymer clay, so it can cure just fine while inside the mold. On the downside, I can't pop out a few of these in an hour. I have to wait a day. That's how long it takes to cure. This clay is water soluble, so I'm using water to soften it up at times and as a mold release agent. With a few small adjustments, like a couple drain channels from the hands, these molds could work easily with poured resin as well. After I get lots of clay pressed into one side, I can wet the other side of the mold and press it together to check my placement of the clay and if I need more. I can also clean up the edges a bit to give me less to trim after it's cured. Let's see what these look like tomorrow. Let's open the molds and see how it went. These are in there very tight. I'm going to try to pry them out as carefully as I can. It feels like the clay is just a little bit soft, which may work in my favor, giving these a little pliability. Anyways, with a bit of effort, I got them out, and they look not too bad. Let's give them a bit of a trim. This excess around where the molds fit together is not too thick, so it shouldn't be hard to clean them up. I'm using a blade, but if there's a lot of trim, you can also use a rotary tool, which works very well with this kind of clay. I added a quick wash of paint just to make the details pop a little. And let's have a final look at these. I'm going to call this a success. It's not a professional level reproduction, but it's pretty good for homemade molds. I hope this video has been helpful and educational for you, and I hope you're enjoying watching the content I make for you. Please like and subscribe if you want to support what I'm doing. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.